The rain pattered against the old diner's roof, the dim yellow lights reflecting off the wet ground, casting an eerie glow. Emily pulled her apron tighter around her waist, her tired eyes drifting toward the empty road outside. Another long, grueling shift awaited her. This diner used to be a lively stop, but a string of mysterious disappearances had scared most customers away. Now, only a handful of long-haul truckers stopped by, along with the occasional stranger passing through. Emily had no choice but to keep working. She needed the money to support her son, Lucas, a 7-year-old boy waiting for her at home with the babysitter. But lately, everything felt like it was getting worse. Her old car had broken down 2 days ago, rent was past due, and Lucas was burning up with a fever. Emily had called the doctor, but she didn't have the money to buy medicine. Desperation tightened around her like an invisible noose. Outside, a sudden flash of lightning split the night sky, casting strange shadows against the window pane. Emily shivered, trying to shake off the unease creeping over her. Maybe she was just exhausted. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted her hair, forced a weary smile onto her face, and turned back toward the counter. She had no idea that tonight would be unlike any night before. The diner door creaked open, and a gust of cold wind swept inside, carrying with it the scent of damp asphalt and something else, something metallic, almost like rust. Emily stiffened. It was late, too late for anyone besides truckers or lost travelers to stop by. But when she turned toward the entrance, her breath caught in her throat. A man stood in the doorway, his silhouette outlined against the dim glow of the flickering streetlight outside. He was tall, with broad shoulders draped in a dark, rain-soaked jacket. A black cap was pulled low over his face, hiding his features in shadow. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, his boots leaving wet prints on the checkered floor. Emily swallowed, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Welcome in. Take any seat you'd like." The man didn't respond. Instead, he scanned the nearly empty diner, his movements slow and deliberate, before settling into the booth farthest from the windows, deep in the shadows. Something about him felt off. It wasn't just the way he moved, but the way the air seemed heavier around him. Emily had served plenty of rough-looking customers before, drifters, loners, even the occasional ex-con who had nowhere else to go, but this was different. This man wasn't just passing through. He was watching, waiting. Trying to ignore the chill crawling up her spine, she grabbed her notepad and approached his table. "What can I get started for you?" For a long moment he said nothing. Then, his fingers, long and slightly weathered, drummed against the tabletop. "Coffee, black." His voice was deep, almost gravelly, like someone who had spent years whispering secrets to the dark. Emily nodded quickly, jotting it down even though she didn't need to. "Anything else?" Another pause. Then, almost too softly, he added, "No onions." Her heart skipped a beat. The words shouldn't have meant anything, but they did. They did. Because earlier that week, she'd heard those exact words. Over the phone. From an unknown caller who had breathed too heavily, lingered too long in silence before hanging up. It had been late at night, just like now. She forced a smile, her fingers gripping the notepad tighter. Coming right up. As she turned toward the counter, she could feel his eyes following her. Not in the casual way most customers did, but with a kind of quiet intensity that sent shivers racing down her arms. The bell above the door jingled suddenly, making her jump. A trucker walked in, shaking rain from his hat. For the first time since the stranger arrived, Emily felt like she could breathe again. She hurried behind the counter, pouring the man's coffee with shaky hands. "Maybe I'm overreacting," she told herself. "Maybe it's just a coincidence." But deep down, she knew better. The way he sat in the darkest corner. The way he barely spoke. The way his presence made the diner feel smaller, like the walls were closing in. She placed the cup on a tray and carried it back to his booth. His hands were resting flat on the table now, still, unmoving. He didn't look up as she set the coffee down. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said, her voice quieter than before. The man slowly raised his head. For the first time, she saw his face clearly, sharp jaw, hollow cheeks, piercing eyes that held something unreadable. He studied her the way someone might study a puzzle, tilting his head slightly. Then, in that same low, gravelly voice, he murmured, "Long shift tonight?" Emily's stomach tightened. She forced a nod. "Yeah. Almost done, though." A ghost of a smile tugged at his lips. "Not quite." The words sent a cold wave through her. She didn't know what he meant, but every instinct in her body told her that something was very, very wrong. The air inside the diner had changed. It was heavier now, thick with the scent of coffee, damp leather, and something else, something that made Emily's skin prickle. She gripped the counter's edge, her pulse thudding in her ears as she watched the man in the booth sip his coffee, slow and deliberate. His words lingered in her mind. Not quite. What had he meant? Was it just a meaningless comment, or something more? Something intentional? The trucker who had walked in moments ago settled into a seat near the window, oblivious to the tension weighing down the room. Emily forced herself to breathe, to move. She grabbed a rag and started wiping down the counter, trying to steady her hands. She glanced back at the stranger. He wasn't looking at her anymore. Instead, his eyes were on the trucker, silent, calculating. The way a predator studies its prey. A shiver ran down her spine. The clock above the kitchen door ticked loudly in the silence. 2:37 a.m. The diner was nearly empty. Just her, the trucker, and him. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Rain streaked the glass, distorting the neon glow from the roadside sign. The night felt endless. Emily swallowed hard and turned toward the coffee machine, her back to the room. She needed to pull herself together. Maybe she was imagining things. Maybe she was just tired. Then she heard it. A chair scraping against the floor. Slow. Purposeful. She turned just in time to see the stranger rising to his feet. Emily froze. He wasn't heading for the door. He was walking toward her. Her breath caught as he stopped at the counter, just an arm's length away. Close enough that she could see the faint scar running along his jawline, the deep-set shadows beneath his eyes. He placed a $20 bill on the counter. "Keep the change," he murmured. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit. The bell above the door jingled. The cold night air rushed in. And then, he was gone. Emily let out a shaky breath, pressing a hand to her chest. The diner suddenly felt too quiet, as if it had been holding its breath along with her. She turned toward the trucker, expecting him to look just as uneasy. But he was relaxed, sipping his coffee, scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened. Maybe nothing had happened. Maybe she really was just exhausted, her mind playing tricks on her. She exhaled, forcing a small laugh at herself. "I need sleep." And then, the phone rang. Emily flinched, the sound slicing through the stillness. She hesitated before reaching for it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the receiver to her ear. "Hello." For a moment, there was nothing. Just dead air. A breath. Slow. Heavy. Her heart slammed against her ribs. And then, a voice. Gravelly. Not quite. Emily's blood turned to ice. The line went dead. The phone call hung in Emily's mind long after the line went dead, the eerie words echoing in her head like a sinister whisper. Not quite. The way the voice had lingered on the phrase sent a chill down her spine. She had tried to shake it off, convinced it was just a twisted prank, but a gnawing sense of dread refused to loosen its grip. The night seemed to stretch on, each passing moment heavier than the last. She was back at the counter, wiping down the same spot she had cleaned a dozen times, trying to ignore the way her hands trembled. The soft hum of the jukebox playing a forgotten tune was the only sound in the diner now. Even the trucker had finished his coffee and disappeared into the rain, leaving Emily alone in the oppressive quiet. She glanced toward the exit, expecting the stranger to return, his shadow looming, watching her every move. But the diner was empty, save for the lingering smell of coffee and burnt toast. Still, something in her gut told her he wasn't gone, not really. His presence had been more than just a fleeting visit. It was as though he had left an imprint on the very air of the room, a subtle reminder that something had shifted, something had changed. Her hand shook as she picked up the phone again, her mind racing. She had no idea who had called, but the voice, it sounded so familiar, so deliberate. It was the same voice from earlier, his voice. She felt it deep in her bones. The bell over the door jingled again, and her heart lurched, fingers tightening around the phone. She turned to find the stranger standing in the doorway, his silhouette barely visible through the rain-streaked glass. This time, his hat was tipped low, his face shadowed in the dim light. For a moment, she couldn't move, her body frozen by some primal instinct that told her to run, to hide. But she didn't. Instead, she took a deep breath and wiped her palms on her apron. The diner was her world, and she wouldn't let him, whatever he was, take that from her. He stepped inside, the door creaking behind him. The air grew colder, and Emily could feel the weight of his eyes on her, even though he hadn't moved closer yet. She tried to focus on something else, anything else, but his presence was like a heavy weight pressing against her chest, squeezing the air out of her lungs. His steps were slow, deliberate, almost measured as he walked to the counter. She couldn't tell if he was looking at her or simply moving through the space, but it felt like his every motion was meant to provoke her, to make her question everything she thought she knew about the world. "Something wrong?" Emily asked, forcing the words out through a throat that felt too tight. He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stop. Emily felt a wave of unease wash over her, the words not quite hanging between them like a dark cloud. But then he spoke, his voice low, almost casual, as though he hadn't just left her a terrifying message only minutes ago. "No," he said simply, his gaze unwavering. "Just had to make sure you were all right." Emily swallowed hard. "I'm fine," she said, though she wasn't sure if she believed herself. The stranger nodded slowly, as if he were assessing her. And then, with a flick of his wrist, he pulled something from his coat pocket, a small piece of paper, and slid it toward her across the counter. She didn't reach for it immediately, her fingers frozen in place. The familiar weight of the note was almost more than she could bear. "What's this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A reminder," he said, a cryptic smile pulling at the corner of his lips. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked back toward the door, his footsteps eerily silent. The bell above the door jingled again, but this time, the sound felt like a death knell. Emily stared at the note, her hands trembling as she picked it up. Her mind raced, but she didn't have the courage to open it, not yet. The fear that had been growing inside her now gripped her in a vice, the air thick with the smell of coffee and anticipation. The note was small, folded tightly, as though it had been carefully prepared. Her fingers shook as she unfolded it, revealing just a few words written in a neat, deliberate script. "You're closer than you think." Emily's breath hitched. The words felt like a warning, a puzzle that she wasn't sure she was ready to solve. But deep down she knew he wasn't done with her. The stranger's cryptic message lingered in the air, filling the space between what she knew and what she feared. And in that moment, she realized the truth. Her life had already shifted, and she was no longer the same person she had been before the stranger walked into her diner. The fear, the uncertainty, it wasn't going away. But now, she had no choice but to face it. What was he trying to tell her? Emily sat motionless, the note still clutched in her trembling fingers, the words, "You're closer than you think," haunting her like an unanswered question. The diner had grown quieter with the passing moments, the low hum of the jukebox the only sound breaking the silence. But inside, the air felt thick, charged with an electricity that made her skin crawl. What did it mean? Closer than you think. Closer to what? To the truth? To danger? The fear gnawed at her, but so did the nagging curiosity. What was the stranger trying to tell her? She couldn't escape the feeling that she was walking on the edge of something dark, something she didn't fully understand, but that she was somehow already entwined in. She glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. The night was creeping toward its end, but Emily had no intention of going home yet. The strange call earlier, the haunting words, and now the note. It was all too much for her to ignore. For the first time since she'd opened the diner that evening, she felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to escape, but at the same time, she was paralyzed by a force that kept her anchored to this place, to the questions and the fear. The rain outside had slowed to a light drizzle, the streets glistening under the dim glow of the streetlights. Her eyes shifted toward the door, where the stranger had left just moments before. His presence had been so unsettling, so tangible, yet it was gone now, leaving only an empty space behind. It was as if he had never been there at all. But he had. And he was still there, in the note, in the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Emily stood up slowly, the diner's cool linoleum floor cold beneath her bare feet. She walked to the counter and stared at the small paper, the ink still fresh in her mind. She could feel his eyes on her, even though he was gone. The smile on his lips had been too knowing, too deliberate. It was as if he'd been waiting for her to figure something out, something that would change everything. Her hand reached for the phone again, the urge to call someone, to tell them what had happened, becoming too strong to ignore. She dialed the number, her fingers moving with an urgency that mirrored the racing of her heart. The line rang 3 times before it was picked up. "Tasha," Emily breathed, her voice shaky. "I need your help." Tasha's voice came through the receiver, calm and familiar. "What's going on? You sound shaken." Emily hesitated, the words stuck in her throat. She wanted to explain everything, but she wasn't sure where to start. How could she make Tasha understand? A man came in to Tasha. He said something strange. "Left me a note." Tasha was silent for a beat. "What did the note say?" Emily's pulse quickened. "You're closer than you think." Tasha's sharp intake of breath sent a shiver down Emily's spine. "What the hell does that mean?" "That's what I need to figure out," Emily replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know why, but I feel like I'm being watched. Like there's something I'm not seeing, something I'm not understanding. But I can't shake this feeling that this man knows something about me, about my life." Tasha was quiet for a long moment, the weight of Emily's words settling between them. Finally she spoke, her tone firm but gentle. "Emily, you need to be careful. People like that, people who show up out of nowhere and leave cryptic notes, they don't just vanish. They have their reasons and they don't always mean good things." Emily swallowed hard. "I know. But I feel like I'm too close to something, like if I turn away now, I'll never know the truth. I can't go back to living the way I was. I need to understand what he wants, why he's doing this." Tasha sighed, a sound filled with concern. "Okay, but promise me you won't do this alone. You have me, you know that, right?" Emily nodded, even though Tasha couldn't see her. "I promise." She hung up the phone, her mind spinning. Her heart was racing, a mixture of dread and anticipation making her feel like she was standing on the precipice of something much larger than she could handle. But it was already too late to turn back. In the distance, Emily heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the diner, slow and steady, each one echoing in the silence. She froze, the blood running cold in her veins. Could it be him again? Had he come back? Her eyes darted toward the door, and for a split second, she thought she saw a figure moving just outside, casting a long, dark shadow against the rain-slicked window. And then the bell above the door chimed again. Her breath caught in her throat as the door creaked open, the stranger stepping inside. This time, his face was obscured by a hood, his posture even more imposing than before. But as his eyes met hers across the room, Emily knew she couldn't escape this. He was here. And the truth, the answers she sought, were closer than she thought. The stranger's return sent a chill down Emily's spine, the weight of his presence filling the diner as the door creaked shut behind him. Her heart raced, her palms clammy against the counter. He didn't look directly at her, but she felt his eyes on her, as if his gaze was an invisible thread pulling at her very soul. His movements were deliberate, slow, as though he had all the time in the world, but Emily knew better. There was something urgent in the air, something she couldn't ignore. She fought the instinct to run, to lock herself in the back room and pretend this wasn't happening. But she couldn't. Not anymore. She had come too far, followed the thread of strange clues, and allowed herself to be pulled into this strange, unnerving web. And now, here he was again, standing in her diner like an apparition from a nightmare. The note had haunted her every waking moment since he left, each word seared into her mind. "You're closer than you think." Closer to what? Closer to answers? Or to something darker? She forced herself to take a deep breath, trying to steady her shaking hands. The diner felt suddenly too small, the walls closing in around her as the stranger approached the counter. This wasn't just another odd moment in a long night of work. This was something bigger, something more dangerous. And she was at the center of it. He slid into a booth at the back, the same place he had sat earlier, and without a word, gestured for Emily to join him. Her legs felt like lead as she walked toward him, her mind screaming to turn away, to run for help, but she knew there was no running from this. The moment had arrived. "Sit down, Emily." His voice was low, calm, too calm. "I think you're ready to understand." Emily sat down across from the stranger, her heart full of anxiety but also undeniable curiosity. It felt as though the world was slowing down, everything seeming to freeze when he spoke. "I know you've endured a lot over the past while. But you are the one who will decide whether to move forward or turn back. The opportunity is always right in front of you, but do you have the courage to seize it?" His words hit Emily's heart like a strong blow, and a surge of unnamed emotions flooded her. She recalled all the struggles, every drop of sweat and tear she had shed. But now, in this moment, she realized something. She was the one holding the power to decide her own fate. The fear had faded, replaced by calm and confidence. Emily stood up, her eyes full of determination and no longer filled with confusion. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. It was not just a promise to herself but a declaration for a new beginning. As she turned and walked out, the morning sunlight illuminated the path ahead, and Emily knew that no matter how difficult life might get, she would never be alone again. Advice for applying in life. 1. Face your fears. Don't shy away from your worries. Face them. Only by overcoming fear can you truly grow. 2. Courage to change. Sometimes, change is the key to unlocking new opportunities. Don't be afraid to change if it helps you evolve. 3. Believe in yourself. Trust your abilities. You can overcome any challenge if you remain determined. 4. Seize opportunities. Opportunities sometimes come unexpectedly. Don't let them slip away. Be ready to act when the moment comes.